Aaliyah and Elias had the perfect love story. Childhood best friends turned soulmates, their bond unshakable. Their wedding was a dream, but just minutes after saying, "I do," fate struck. A tragic helicopter crash turned their fairy tale into a fight for survival. Love, fear, and destiny collided on that mountain. Did they make it? Where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe for more incredible stories. You won't want to miss what comes next. Aaliyah Carter and Elias Monroe were born just a few months apart in the same elite neighborhood of Los Angeles. Their parents were more than just business partners. They were lifelong friends, bound by trust, history, and an unspoken understanding that their families would always look out for one another. The Carters built their wealth in fashion and luxury branding, while the Monroes were an influential name in real estate and architecture. Between extravagant galas, weekend yacht parties, and holiday getaways to European villas, Aaliyah and Elias grew up in a world of privilege. But for them, none of that mattered as much as the bond they shared. From the moment they could walk, they were inseparable. As toddlers, Aaliyah would tug at Elias's sleeve whenever she wanted to play, and he would follow without hesitation. She was the fearless one, climbing trees too high, running too fast, daring to touch the ocean waves even as they crashed against the shore. Elias, ever the cautious thinker, was always behind her, warning her of the risks, but never stopping her. If she fell, he was there to pull her up. If she laughed, he laughed with her. They were opposite in every way, yet somehow they fit together perfectly. Their mothers, both powerful businesswomen who had shattered glass ceilings in their industries, often arranged playdates, knowing how much their children adored each other. Their fathers would joke over whiskey that destiny had already written their children's future, that one day Aaliyah and Elias would stand at the altar, just like their families had always hoped. At the time, the thought seemed absurd to them. They were best friends, nothing more. As the years passed, their bond only grew stronger. At 10 years old, Aaliyah dragged Elias into her world of wild imagination, where they weren't just children, but explorers, time travelers, and heroes in grand adventures of their own making. She would spend hours sketching dresses for queens and warriors, insisting that one day she'd be a world-famous designer. Elias, with his meticulous nature, would sit beside her, drawing blueprints for castles and cities, his mind already shaped by the legacy his father had built in architecture. By middle school, their dynamic was well established. Aaliyah was fiery and impulsive, always leaping before she looked. She would doodle in the margins of her textbooks instead of paying attention in class, always daydreaming about a bigger, brighter world beyond the confines of their school halls. Elias, logical and steady, was the one who reminded her to focus, whispering answers when the teacher caught her lost in thought. But even in his quiet, calculated way, he was never dull. He had a sharp wit, a mind for strategy, and a patience that balanced Aaliyah's restless energy. Then came high school, and everything started to shift in ways neither of them had anticipated. It was subtle at first, the way Elias began noticing how Aaliyah's laughter had a way of lighting up an entire room, or how her presence felt like an electric current whenever she was near. Aaliyah, in turn, found herself watching Elias more closely, seeing how he had grown taller, how his quiet confidence made him stand out in a crowd without even trying. Others noticed, too. Their classmates started whispering, nudging them with knowing smiles, asking if they were finally together. At first they laughed it off, but over time the question stopped feeling so absurd. By 16, the invisible line between friendship and something more had blurred beyond recognition. One evening, after hours of studying for their finals, They found themselves on the rooftop of Aaliyah's house, watching the city lights stretch endlessly into the horizon. The sky was painted in hues of violet and gold, and the air was warm, carrying the scent of jasmine from the garden below. Aaliyah sat cross-legged, absent-mindedly twisting a loose thread on her sweater, her thoughts tangled in something she hadn't yet found the courage to say. "Do you ever wonder?" she murmured, breaking the comfortable silence. Elias turned to her, brow furrowing. "Wonder what?" She hesitated. Then, with the kind of reckless bravery that had always defined her, she met his gaze and said, "What it would be like if we were more than this." Elias felt his pulse quicken. He had thought about it. Of course he had. He had spent countless nights staring at the ceiling, wondering what it would mean if he reached for her the way he wanted to. But he had never dared to say it aloud. Yet, here she was, voicing the very thought that had been lingering between them for months. "Yeah," he admitted after a long pause. "I do." Aaliyah smiled then, a slow, knowing smile, as if she had found the answer she had been searching for. Before either of them could overthink it, she leaned in and pressed the lightest, most fleeting kiss against his lips. It was nothing grand, nothing dramatic, just a simple moment, a spark igniting something that had been waiting to catch fire. That night, everything changed. They didn't talk about it right away. There was no dramatic confession, no immediate declaration of love. Instead, their relationship evolved naturally, slipping into something new without needing to be defined. They still teased each other, still competed over who was better at arcade games, still challenged each other in ways only they could. But now, there were stolen glances across crowded rooms, hands brushing just a little too long, whispered words that carried a weight neither of them had fully understood before. Love, as they discovered, wasn't just about grand gestures or perfect moments. It was in the way Elias pulled Elia's scarf tighter around her neck when the winter wind bit too sharply. It was in the way Elias stayed up with Elias on nights he was buried under blueprints, sketching dresses beside him just to keep him company. It was in the arguments, their inevitable clashes when her impulsiveness met his practicality, and in the apologies, the quiet way they always found their way back to each other. Not everyone believed their love would last. Some said young love was fleeting, that they would grow apart, that once college and careers came into play, they'd leave this behind as just another childhood memory. But Aaliyah and Elias didn't care. They knew what they had was real, and they weren't about to let go of it just because the world doubted them. By the time they were 18, they had already begun planning their future. Not in the formal, structured way that adults did, but in the way dreamers do, talking about the cities they wanted to visit, the life they wanted to build together. They applied to universities in the same city, promising each other that no matter what, they would always choose each other. And so, as they stood on the brink of adulthood, Aaliyah and Elias believed without hesitation, without doubt, that they were meant to be. That no matter what the future held, they would face it together. What they didn't know was just how much their love would be tested in the years to come. The shift in their relationship was gradual, like the slow bloom of a flower, unfolding petal by petal, until one day it was impossible to ignore. Aaliyah and Elias never sat down to define what they were. They didn't need to. It was in the way they gravitated toward each other, even in crowded rooms. In the way their hands always seemed to find each other without thinking. It was in the way Elias, ever observant, would silently slide Aaliyah's favorite drink across the table before she even ordered, or how she would instinctively save the last bite of her dessert for him, knowing he'd never ask, but always appreciate it. The world around them seemed to take notice before they did. Their friends would roll their eyes whenever Elias playfully rested her head on Elias's shoulder during movie nights, or when he absent-mindedly brushed a stray curl from her face in the middle of a conversation. It was as if everyone had been waiting for them to acknowledge what had been obvious all along. Even their parents, who had once joked about their children's inevitable love story, began speaking about their future together with less humor and more certainty. But with the deepening of love came the weight of new emotions: uncertainty, vulnerability, the fear of losing something too precious to risk. Aaliyah had always been fearless in everything she did, yet when it came to Elias, she found herself hesitating in ways she never had before. It terrified her how much she needed him, how much her world seemed to revolve around his steady presence. Love, she realized, was not just about excitement and passion. It was also about trust, about surrendering parts of yourself to someone else with the hope that they would never break you. Elias, logical and composed as he always was, faced his own silent battle. He had spent his entire life carefully planning his future, structuring his ambitions in a way that made sense. Loving Aaliyah was the one thing he had never accounted for, the one variable in his perfectly drawn-out blueprint that made him question everything. It wasn't that he doubted their love, he never had, but he wondered if love alone was enough to withstand the unpredictable paths they were bound to take. Their first real fight came on a warm autumn night, not over anything significant, but over the realization that the world was bigger than just the two of them. They were 17, standing on the edge of the future, and for the first time, the idea of leaving home, of leaving each other, even temporarily, became a reality they could no longer ignore. "I got into Parsons," Aaliyah announced one night over dinner, her voice careful, watching Elias's reaction closely. Parsons School of Design, her dream since she was 10, the place where she knew she could become the designer she had always envisioned herself to be. Elias set his fork down, nodding slowly. "That's amazing, Aaliyah." His voice was steady, but there was something unreadable in his expression. She hesitated. "It's in New York." "I know." Silence stretched between them, filled with a tension neither of them knew how to navigate. "I applied to UCLA," Elias finally said, his voice quiet. "I got in." Aaliyah exhaled sharply, a mixture of relief and heartbreak. "So, we're really going to be on opposite coasts." He looked at her then, really looked at her, and for the first time she saw the flicker of doubt in his eyes. "We always knew this was a possibility, but we never talked about it," she countered, a hint of frustration creeping into her voice. "We just assumed we'd figure it out." "Because we will," Elias said simply, but there was an edge to his words, something unspoken lingering beneath them. Aaliyah shook her head. "You don't get it, do you? This isn't just some minor inconvenience. We'll be thousands of miles apart, different time zones, different lives." Elias's jaw tightened. "And what are you saying? That we shouldn't even try?" She opened her mouth, then closed it, realizing she didn't have an answer. That was the problem. She didn't know. She had never known anything other than Elias being right beside her, and the thought of anything else made her feel like the ground was shifting beneath her feet. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Aaliyah, I love you. That doesn't change just because we'll be in different places." She swallowed, her heart aching at the certainty in his voice. "And what if it does?" she whispered, almost afraid of her own words. Elias's expression softened. "Then we fight for it." For a moment, she just stared at him, at the boy she had loved for as long as she could remember, and in that moment, she realized that maybe love wasn't about knowing all the answers. Maybe it was about choosing each other, even when nothing was certain. So, they made a promise, one that was as fragile as it was hopeful. They would try. They would call. They would visit. They would make it work. Because what they had was worth fighting for. The summer before college was bittersweet, filled with moments they both clung to, as if trying to memorize every second before life inevitably pulled them apart. They took road trips up the coast, spent nights lying on the beach, counting stars and pretending that the world wasn't about to change. Elias surprised Aaliyah with a sketchbook filled with designs inspired by her, each one meticulously drawn, proving that even in his structured mind, she had always been his greatest inspiration. And when the day finally came, when Aaliyah stood at the airport gate, her heart hammering in her chest, as she looked at Elias for what felt like the last time before everything changed, she whispered the words she had once been too afraid to say. "I love you." Elias smiled, that slow, knowing smile that had always calmed the storms inside her. "I love you too." Then, with one final kiss, she turned and walked away, stepping into the unknown, carrying their love with her, like a flame she refused to let burn out. The months that followed were both beautiful and unbearable. They texted, they FaceTimed, they sent each other pictures of the places they wished they could explore together. But time moved differently when love was stretched across a country, and there were days when the distance felt impossible to bridge. Aaliyah buried herself in her designs, in the whirlwind of the fashion world that both exhilarated and exhausted her. Elias, always methodical, balanced architecture with late-night calls, knowing that even through a screen, Aaliyah was still the most real thing in his life. There were fights, about missed calls, about unspoken fears, about the way life seemed to be moving too fast without them in it together. But there were also moments of raw, unshaken love, like when Elias surprised Aaliyah in New York on her birthday, standing outside her apartment in the pouring rain, grinning like an idiot with her favorite pastries in hand. "I told you I'd always show up," he had said, and in that moment, Aaliyah knew, no matter how far, no matter how hard, they were still them. Years passed, and against the odds, they made it. Through sleepless nights, through distance, through the chaos of becoming adults, they chose each other. And when they both finally graduated, when Elias stood at the airport this time, waiting for Aaliyah to return home, it felt like the universe had conspired to bring them full circle. She ran into his arms, laughing, crying, whispering, "We made it." Elias held her close, pressing his lips to her temple. "We always would have." What they didn't know was that love, as strong as it was, could not defy fate. And fate had already written a story neither of them were prepared for. The night Elias proposed, the sky over Santorini burned in shades of violet and gold, the kind of sunset that made the world feel like it had been painted just for them. The Aegean Sea stretched endlessly before them, shimmering under the last light of the day, waves kissing the rugged cliffs below. Aaliyah had always dreamed of coming here. For years she had spoken of the island as if it were some faraway paradise, a place she could only touch in her imagination. But Elias had made it real. She had no idea what he had planned. To her, this was just another adventure, another chapter in the long history of their love, a spontaneous getaway to celebrate their postgraduate lives, their survival of years apart, their return to each other. They had promised they would take a trip once they both finished school, and as always, Elias had kept his word. What she didn't know was that he had been carrying a ring for weeks, waiting for the perfect moment. The evening had been nothing short of perfect. They had wandered the whitewashed streets, their fingers intertwined, stopping at little cafes and street vendors, sharing stolen kisses beneath the glow of lanterns. Elia had sketched designs in her journal inspired by the colors and textures around her, while Elias had studied the architecture, mesmerized by the harmony between the ancient and the modern. They had always been that way, seeing the world through different lenses, yet somehow always finding beauty in the same places. Dinner was set on a private terrace overlooking the caldera, the table adorned with flickering candles and scattered rose petals. The restaurant staff had been in on Elia's plan, though Elia remained blissfully unaware, too caught up in the moment, in the way the wine tasted sweeter here, in the way the wind carried whispers of laughter from the town below. She was telling Elias about a new collection she wanted to design, her hands animated, eyes shining with excitement. He watched her, completely captivated, knowing there would never be a more perfect time. As the last rays of sunlight dipped below the horizon, he reached for her hand. "Elia," he said, his voice steady despite the wild pounding of his heart. She looked at him, her expression softening at the way he said her name, as if it was something sacred. "What's on your mind?" she asked, tilting her head slightly. Elias exhaled, gripping her fingers a little tighter. "I've loved you since before I even understood what love was." Elia blinked, her lips parting slightly, but she didn't interrupt. "We grew up together. We built dreams together. And through everything, distance, late-night calls, the times when life tried to pull us apart, we found our way back. We always do." He swallowed hard, his voice thick with emotion. "And I know, without a single doubt, that there is no life for me without you in it." It hit her then, what was happening. Her breath hitched, her heart tumbling into her stomach as Elias slid from his chair, lowering himself onto one knee. The world around them blurred, the gentle murmur of the sea, the distant clinking of glasses, the golden glow of candlelight. All she could see was him. In his hand was a ring unlike anything she had ever seen. Delicate, custom-made, a brilliant cut diamond at its center, framed by intricate engravings of patterns that symbolized eternity and unity. A piece of art. A piece of them. "Elia Carter," he continued, his voice barely above a whisper now. "I don't want to rush you. I know your dreams, your ambitions, and I would never ask you to give them up. But I also know that no matter where life takes us, I want to walk that path with you. Whether it's now, a year from now, or 10 years from now, I will wait. But if you're ready, if you'll have me, I want to be your husband." For the first time in her life, Elia was speechless. She had imagined this moment before, had allowed herself in fleeting daydreams to wonder what it would feel like. But nothing could have prepared her for the overwhelming wave of emotions that crashed over her now. She saw their entire history in his eyes. The childhood laughter, the teenage whispers, the years spent longing across time zones, the quiet moments where love had been present, even when words weren't enough. She saw their future, stretching endlessly, full of dreams still unwritten. Tears blurred her vision as she let out a choked laugh, nodding rapidly. "Yes," she whispered, 1,000 times yes." The world erupted in applause around them, strangers cheering, cameras flashing, but none of it mattered. Elias slipped the ring onto her finger, and as soon as she saw it there, shining under the soft glow of the terrace lights, she threw herself into his arms, burying her face against his neck. They stayed that way for what felt like forever, holding on to each other, absorbing the weight of this new promise between them. That night, they lay awake in their villa, fingers intertwined, whispering about the life they would build. They spoke of wedding plans, of places they wanted to travel, of the home they would one day create together. They laughed, dreamed, and promised each other forever. And for the first time, forever felt tangible. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of excitement. They returned to Los Angeles to a flood of congratulations, family, friends, even the media, all captivated by their love story. Their engagement became more than just a personal milestone, it became a celebration for everyone who had watched them grow together. Elias' mother cried when she saw the ring, pulling Elias into a tight embrace and whispering, "You were always meant to be her home." Elias's father clapped him on the back, his usual reserved nature breaking just enough for him to say, "Your mother and I always knew you'd choose her." But with the joy came the reality of planning a wedding that was destined to be an event unlike any other. They both came from legacies of wealth and prestige, and while neither of them had ever been ones to indulge in extravagance, this was different. This was their wedding, and it had to be perfect. Choosing the venue was the first major decision. Aaliyah wanted something breathtaking, something timeless, a place that would reflect the depth of their love. It took weeks of searching, but when they arrived at the mountaintop estate overlooking the Pacific, she knew. The air smelled of salt and jasmine, the cliffs stretched endlessly, and at sunset the entire sky melted into gold and crimson. It felt like magic. "This is it," she whispered, standing on the terrace, her fingers laced through Elias's. He squeezed her hand, smiling. "This is where we begin." With the venue secured, the planning spiraled into a frenzy. Aaliyah, ever the perfectionist, worked closely with designers to create a wedding that blended their cultural heritage with modern elegance. Her dress, custom designed by one of the top names in haute couture, would feature intricate beadwork and patterns inspired by her ancestry. The floral arrangements would be towering, cascading with white orchids. The reception would take place in a grand glass pavilion, where the ocean and sky would serve as their backdrop. Elias, though far less concerned with details, had his own vision. He wanted warmth. He wanted joy. He wanted the people who mattered most to be surrounded by love, by the feeling that this wasn't just another lavish event. It was the celebration of something rare and real. As the months passed, the anticipation grew. Interviews, magazine features, whispers of their wedding being the event of the year. It was overwhelming at times, but in the quiet moments, when it was just them, none of it mattered. One night, as they sat on their balcony, watching the city lights flicker below, Aaliyah rested her head against Elias's shoulder. "All of this planning," she murmured. "The flowers, the dress, the guest list, none of it really matters." Elias chuckled. "Pretty sure your planner would disagree." She smiled, then turned to face him. "The only thing I'm really looking forward to is walking toward you, knowing that when I reach you, nothing else will matter." Elias reached for her, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "More than ever," he whispered. "That's all I want." What neither of them knew was that fate had already decided that their love story would not be written in decades, but in days. That the moment Aaliyah walked toward Elias, toward their future, would also be the last moment she would ever see him standing, waiting, smiling. Because love, no matter how strong, could never outrun destiny. The morning of their wedding dawned with a golden glow. the first light of the sun spilling over the cliffs and illuminating the ocean below. The mountaintop estate was already a scene of breathtaking beauty. White roses cascaded from towering floral installations. Delicate gold-scented chairs lined the courtyard in perfect symmetry, and the reception hall, with its grand glass walls, shimmered under the soft reflection of the sea. Every detail had been carefully curated, every element designed to tell the story of two lives that had intertwined so seamlessly they could never be separated. Inside a sun-drenched suite, Aliyah stood before a floor-length mirror, her mother adjusting the delicate embroidery on her gown. The dress was a masterpiece, a fusion of modern haute couture and the intricate beadwork of her heritage, designed with patterns that symbolized love, eternity, and unity. She had spent months perfecting it, ensuring that when she walked down the aisle, she wouldn't just be a bride, she would be a vision of everything she and Elias had built together. Her mother's hands trembled slightly as she fastened the last clasp, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "You look," she exhaled, shaking her head, as if words could never be enough. "You are breathtaking, Aliyah." Aliyah turned, taking her mother's hands in hers. "Are you going to cry?" she teased, though her own throat felt tight with emotion. Her mother let out a soft laugh, blinking rapidly. "Maybe just a little." Before Aliyah could respond, there was a knock at the door, followed by the familiar voice of her father. "Can I come in?" Her mother stepped aside, giving him space as he entered. Her father, always composed, always the pillar of strength, stopped in his tracks when he saw her. For a long moment he said nothing. Then, in a rare moment of vulnerability, he exhaled deeply and ran a hand down his face, as if trying to steady himself. "You look just like your mother did on our wedding day," he murmured. Aliyah felt her heart squeeze. Her father had always been a man of few words. His love shone through actions rather than sentiment. But in this moment, as he stood before her, she saw the weight of the day settling over him, the bittersweet realization that his little girl was stepping into a new life, one that would no longer revolve around him. He cleared his throat, straightening his tie. "Are you ready?" Aliyah smiled, gripping his arm. "I've never been more ready." Across the estate, in a suite overlooking the cliffs, Elias stood in front of the mirror, adjusting the cufflinks on his ivory suit. His best man, Jordan, leaned against the doorway, watching him with a smirk. "You nervous?" Jordan asked, though they both already knew the answer. Elias met his own gaze in the reflection, a slow smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "Not even a little." Jordan let out a low whistle. "Man, you really love her." Elias turned then, his expression turning serious. "She's my whole world." Jordan nodded, patting him on the back. "Then let's get you married." As the guests arrived, a hushed anticipation filled the air. The ceremony was set in an open courtyard with sweeping ocean views, the white rose canopy swaying gently in the breeze. Family, friends, and industry elites took their seats, whispering in awe at the sheer elegance of it all. The music began, soft and melodic, a signal that the moment had arrived. Elias stood at the altar, his heart hammering in his chest as the doors to the grand entrance slowly swung open. And then, there she was. Aliyah stepped into the light, her gown shimmering with every graceful step she took. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd, but she didn't hear it. Her eyes were locked on Elias, on the way his breath caught the moment he saw her. It was as if the world around them had blurred, as if nothing else existed except for this moment. Her father led her forward, his grip strong but full of emotion. When they reached the altar, he looked at Elias, not just as a father giving away his daughter, but as a man entrusting his most precious treasure to another. And then, with a firm nod, he placed Elias' hand in Elias's and stepped back. The ceremony felt like a dream. The officiant's words faded into the background as Elias and Elias stood before each other, hands entwined, their souls speaking louder than any vow ever could. When it was time for their promises, Elias took a steadying breath, her fingers trembling only slightly as she held Elias's hands. "You have been my best friend, my safe place, my greatest love," she began, her voice steady despite the emotion threatening to spill over. "You have stood by me in every triumph and every failure. You have loved me without hesitation, without condition, and today I vow to do the same. No matter where life takes us, no matter what challenges we face, I will always choose you." Elias's jaw tightened, his own emotions breaking through his usually calm demeanor. When he spoke, his voice was thick with love, raw and unguarded. "I have loved you since we were kids," he said, his fingers tightening around hers. "Before I even knew what love was, I knew you, and every day since, you have been my home. I vow to stand beside you in every storm, to build a life with you that is strong, that is unshakable. No matter what happens, no matter what life brings, you will always be my choice." Tears shimmered in Elias's eyes as the officiant asked for the rings. They slid them onto each other's fingers, the simple, perfect bands catching the golden light. And then, the words that sealed their forever. "I now pronounce you husband and wife." Elias didn't hesitate. He pulled Elias into him, pressing a deep, lingering kiss against her lips as the crowd erupted in applause. The world blurred for a moment. The sound of cheers, the shimmer of candlelight, the ocean breeze wrapping around them like a blessing. The reception was nothing short of spectacular. The glass pavilion was transformed into a wonderland of golden candlelight and cascading floral arrangements, the dance floor never empty. Elias and Elias moved through the night as if they were floating, stealing kisses, exchanging whispered secrets, lost in the joy of knowing they had finally arrived at forever. And then, the surprise. Elias's father stood at the center of the room, clinking his glass to gather attention. When the room fell silent, he gestured toward the open terrace, where the estate's private helipad had been set up. A sleek, luxurious helicopter sat waiting, its black and gold exterior gleaming under the reception lights. Elias turned to her father, eyes wide with disbelief. "Dad, what is this?" Her father smiled, a mixture of pride and love in his expression. "A gift. A chance for you and Elias to see the world from a new perspective, together." Excited murmurs filled the air as the realization set in. This was no ordinary wedding gift. This was an experience, an unforgettable adventure, to mark the beginning of their new life. Elias glanced at Elias, silently asking if she was up for it. Despite the whirlwind of emotions inside her, she nodded, a slow smile spreading across her face. "I can't believe this," she whispered as they were guided toward the helicopter. As they approached, her father clapped Elias on the shoulder, his voice low. "Take care of her." Elias met his gaze and nodded. "Always." With one final wave to their guests, they climbed inside, the cabin luxurious, designed for comfort. Elias reached for Elias's hand as the pilot began the pre-flight check, squeezing it gently. The engines roared to life, the rotor blades spun, the guests below cheered, lifting their glasses in celebration as the helicopter lifted off into the night sky. Neither of them knew that in just minutes, their perfect night would turn into an unimaginable nightmare. The night air was crisp and cool as the helicopter lifted off the helipad, the rhythmic hum of the rotor blades mixing with the distant sound of waves crashing against the cliffs below. From inside the luxurious cabin, Aaliyah gazed out at the glittering lights of the reception fading beneath them, the estate growing smaller with each passing second. It felt surreal. One moment they had been surrounded by laughter, music, and the warmth of their loved ones, and now it was just the two of them, soaring into the night. She turned to Elias, her fingers still tightly wrapped around his. His face was bathed in the soft glow of the instrument panel, his expression relaxed yet filled with an unspoken exhilaration. He caught her staring and smirked. "What?" he asked, his voice low and teasing. Aaliyah shook her head, unable to stop the smile that spread across her lips. "Nothing. Just... I still can't believe this. Any of it." She glanced down at the ring on her finger, twisting it slightly, as if reassuring herself that this moment was real. Elias lifted their intertwined hands, pressing a slow kiss to her knuckles. "Believe it," he murmured. "Because this is just the beginning." The pilot's voice crackled through the headset. "We'll be taking a scenic route along the coast before circling back. Should be about 30 minutes. Enjoy the ride, Mr. and Mrs. Monroe." Aaliyah exhaled a small laugh at the sound of her new last name. She leaned into Elias, resting her head against his shoulder, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breathing. For the first time all day, everything was still. Just the two of them, suspended between earth and sky, untouchable. Outside, the coastline stretched endlessly, the ocean reflecting the moonlight like shattered silver. The city lights of Los Angeles twinkled in the distance, a reminder of the life waiting for them beyond this perfect night. They had talked about their honeymoon. Paris, then Morocco, maybe even a stop in Tokyo. But right now, none of that mattered. This moment in the sky was theirs. Elias sighed contentedly, tracing circles against the back of her hand. "You happy?" Aaliyah tilted her head up, meeting his gaze. "More than I ever thought possible." Elias grinned, leaning in to press a lingering kiss to her lips. And just as she began to lose herself in the warmth of it, the helicopter jolted. Sharp, sudden, unnatural. Aaliyah gasped, instinctively gripping Elias's arm as the aircraft lurched sideways. The cabin lights flickered, and a low warning chime filled the space. The pilot's voice returned, this time sharper, edged with tension. "We've hit some unexpected turbulence, just a little rough air. Stay calm." Elias immediately went rigid, his instincts kicking in. He wrapped an arm around Aaliyah, his body bracing hers against the seat. "It's okay," he murmured, though his voice wasn't as steady as before. Another jolt, this time stronger. The helicopter tilted unnaturally, the horizon outside shifting at a sickening angle. The warning chime turned into a rapid, urgent beeping. Aaliyah's stomach dropped, panic clawing at her throat. The once peaceful ocean below now spun wildly, a dizzying blur of dark water and jagged cliffs. The pilot's voice crackled again, louder, more urgent. "We're losing stability. Hold on!" Aaliyah barely had time to process his words before the aircraft suddenly dipped, plummeting several feet in a violent drop. Her scream was swallowed by the deafening roar of the wind outside. Elias held on to her, his grip a vice around her waist as the helicopter continued its erratic descent. The instrument panel was flashing red, alarms blaring in rapid succession. The pilot fought for control, his hands gripping the controls with desperate precision. "Brace for impact!" he shouted. And then, everything happened at once. The helicopter pitched forward, spinning uncontrollably. The ocean and cliffs twisted in and out of view in rapid succession. Aaliyah's breath hitched as gravity pulled them violently downward. Her fingers dug into Elias's suit, her mind screaming that this couldn't be happening. Not now. Not tonight. The last thing she saw was Elias's face, his eyes locked onto hers, a silent promise passing between them. And then, impact. A thunderous crash shattered the night. Metal screeched against rock. The windshield exploded inward, shards of glass slicing through the air. The helicopter crumpled as it struck the rocky mountainside, its body twisting under the sheer force of the collision. The sound of ripping metal and splintering debris drowned out everything else. For a moment there was only chaos, flames erupting from the ruptured fuel tank, smoke pouring into the night sky. The aircraft groaned under its own weight, balancing precariously on the cliff's edge, half on solid ground, half dangling over the abyss. And then, silence. Aaliyah's ears rang, a high-pitched whine drowning out everything else. Her vision blurred, pain flooding every inch of her body. Blood trickled down her forehead, warm and sticky, blurring her vision further. She tried to move, but every muscle screamed in protest. Elias. Her heart lurched, panic snapping her back to reality. She turned her head, her limbs sluggish, unresponsive. Smoke curled through the broken remains of the cabin, thick and suffocating. She coughed, her throat raw, her lungs burning. Her trembling fingers reached out, searching. "Elias?" Her voice was barely a whisper, weak and hoarse. She found him slumped against the wreckage, his once pristine ivory suit now stained with soot and blood. His chest rose and fell in shallow, uneven breaths. Relief and terror warred inside her. He was alive, but barely. The wreckage creaked beneath them, a terrifying groan of shifting metal against unstable rock. Aaliyah's breath hitched. The helicopter was still moving, tilting, inching closer to the edge. They didn't have much time. Summoning every ounce of strength left in her battered body, she forced herself to move. Every inch felt like agony, but she didn't stop. Crawling toward Elias, she grabbed his face with trembling hands. "Elias, wake up," she pleaded. "Please, baby, wake up." His eyelids fluttered, a weak groan slipping past his lips. His hand twitched, barely lifting, as though reaching for her but unable to move. Tears blurred her vision. "You have to stay with me. We have to get out of here." The wreckage groaned again, louder this time. The metal beneath them shifted sharply, and suddenly they were tilting. Aaliyah's breath caught in her throat as the realization struck. The helicopter was about to fall. Her survival instincts roared to life. Ignoring the pain, she hooked her arms under Elias's and began dragging him toward the shattered side of the cabin where the fuselage had split open upon impact. Each movement sent fresh waves of agony through her, but she refused to stop. The fire behind them crackled hungrily, sending sparks flying. Smoke burned her lungs, her vision dimming at the edges, but she pushed forward. Just a little farther. A sudden shift beneath them sent her heart plummeting. The wreckage tilted violently, the entire structure slipping further toward the abyss. No. With one final desperate push, She heaved them both out of the wreckage, tumbling onto the rocky ground just as the last remains of the helicopter gave in to gravity. The moment stretched, silent and endless. Then screeching metal, a deafening roar, the wreckage plunged over the cliff. Aaliyah barely had time to turn before the explosion erupted below, the force of it sending waves crashing violently against the rocks. Fire lit up the night sky, the smoke curling high into the darkness. The wreckage was gone. They had barely made it. Gasping for breath, Aaliyah turned to Elias, her entire body trembling. His pulse was weak, his breathing shallow. She gripped his face, tears spilling freely. "Stay with me, Elias," she whispered. "Please, stay with me." Above them, sirens wailed in the distance. Help was coming. But deep down, in the part of her heart she refused to acknowledge, she knew it might not be soon enough. The world around Aaliyah blurred, the taste of smoke thick in her throat, the sharp scent of burning metal and fuel filling her lungs with every shallow, ragged breath. The cold mountain air should have been refreshing, but all she could feel was heat. Scorching, suffocating, relentless. The remnants of the helicopter fire crackled behind her, sending embers drifting into the night sky like fallen stars. But none of it mattered. Elias lay still beside her, his chest rising and falling in weak, uneven breaths, his face smeared with blood and soot. His ivory wedding suit, once pristine, once elegant, was now torn and stained. A tragic reminder of what the night had been before everything shattered. Aaliyah pressed a trembling hand to his cheek. "Elias," she choked out, shaking him gently. "Baby, stay with me, please." He didn't stir. Panic surged through her veins, stronger than the pain that throbbed in every inch of her body. She could feel warm blood trickling from a gash on her forehead, matting her hair, but she ignored it. None of it mattered if Elias didn't wake up. Her hands roamed over his chest, searching for something, anything, some sign that he wasn't slipping away from her. His heartbeat was faint, a fragile rhythm beneath her fingertips, but it was there. He was alive. For now. Tears burned her eyes as she swallowed back a sob. "Help is coming," she whispered, more to herself than to him. "You just have to hold on." Above them, in the distance, she could hear the faint wail of sirens cutting through the silence of the mountain. It was both a promise and a threat. Help was coming, but was it fast enough? A sudden shift beneath her sent her heart slamming against her ribs. The rock they lay on trembled, the unstable ground beneath them groaning under their weight. Aaliyah's breath hitched. The cliff. The helicopter had already tumbled over the edge, crashing into the abyss below in a fiery explosion. But the impact had weakened the entire mountainside, leaving them stranded on a precarious ledge, teetering between survival and the same deadly fate. She turned, her vision hazy, assessing their surroundings. The ground behind them sloped upward in a steep incline, jagged rocks jutting out like broken bones. If she could just get Elias up, if she could just move him a little further from the edge, they might have a chance. Clenching her jaw, she adjusted her grip on him, hooking her arms under his shoulders. Pain screamed through her body as she tried to drag him back, her ribs protesting violently with every inch she gained. Her breath came in gasps, but she didn't stop. "Come on, baby," she murmured, her voice raw with desperation. "Stay with me." Elias groaned softly, a faint, broken sound that sent relief flooding through her. His fingers twitched against hers, the smallest sign of life, but it was enough. "You're okay," she reassured him, though her voice wavered. "I've got you." The ground shifted again. This time, it wasn't subtle. Aaliyah barely had a moment to react before the rock beneath Elias gave way completely, crumbling under his weight. His body began to slip, his unconscious form sliding toward the edge. No, pure, unfiltered terror shot through her, shoving past her exhaustion. Without thinking, she lunged forward, her fingers latching onto the front of his suit, stopping him just inches from the drop. For a second, time froze. Elias dangled dangerously over the abyss, his body limp, his head tilted to the side, eyes barely open. Aaliyah's grip burned, her muscles trembled, her entire body screaming in protest, but she held on. "Elias," she sobbed, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Baby, you have to wake up. I can't do this without you." His lashes fluttered. A sluggish, unfocused movement. His lips parted, but no sound came out. Her heart clenched. "Look at me," she begged. "Please, just look at me." Slowly, so painfully slow, his eyes found hers. Brown, deep, full of something raw and aching. "Ali!" His voice was barely there, a whisper lost in the wind. "Yeah, I'm here," she choked, her grip tightening. "I need you to help me. Can you hold on to me?" He tried, but his fingers barely twitched. He was too weak. A sob tore through her. She couldn't lose him. Not now. Not after everything. Somewhere above, voices rang out, sharp and urgent. The search and rescue team. "Over here!" she screamed, her voice hoarse, desperate. "We're here!" A beam of light swept over them, illuminating the scene. A woman in a torn wedding dress, clinging to a broken man, both balancing on the edge of oblivion. "Ma'am, hold on," a voice called. "We're getting you out." Aaliyah didn't respond. She couldn't. Every ounce of her strength was focused on Elias, on keeping him with her. "Stay with me," she whispered. "Just a little longer." A rope dropped down. A figure in a rescue uniform rappelled toward them, moving swiftly. "We're going to pull you both up," he instructed, securing a harness around her. "Can you let go so we can lift him?" She hesitated, her fingers trembling against Elias's suit. Letting go felt impossible, but she had to trust them. Swallowing back her fear, she released him. The moment his weight left her grasp, her entire body slumped forward, exhaustion crashing over her. She barely registered the moment they were lifted, the feeling of being pulled back from the edge, away from the wreckage, away from death itself. Her vision blurred. The last thing she saw before the darkness took her was Elias being lifted beside her, his body limp, but alive. Alive. Then everything went black. Aaliyah woke to the sterile scent of antiseptic and the distant hum of machines. The world felt heavy, her body sluggish, her thoughts fragmented. She blinked, the bright hospital lights above her too harsh, too real. A gentle hand touched hers. She turned her head, and there he was. Elias. He looked wrecked, his face bruised, his arm bandaged, an IV trailing from his hand. But he was awake. He was alive. Relief hit her so hard it stole her breath. "You're okay," she whispered. Elias exhaled a soft laugh, wincing slightly. "Pretty sure you're the one who saved my life." Tears welled in her eyes. "You scared me," she admitted, squeezing his hand weakly. "I thought I was going to lose you." His grip tightened around hers. "You won't," he murmured. "Not ever." Aaliyah swallowed hard, her chest aching with something too big to name. For a moment, neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. They had survived. Together. But, deep down, in the quiet corners of her mind, a single thought took root. One she couldn't shake. Fate had tried to take him from her once. Would it try again? Aaliyah sat by Elias's hospital bed, her fingers laced tightly with his, as if holding on to him would tether him to this world, to her. The rhythmic beep of the heart monitor was a steady reminder that he was still here, still breathing, but every shallow rise and fall of his chest felt like a fragile thread keeping him from slipping away. His face was bruised, a thin bandage running along his temple where shards of glass had cut deep, and his normally steady hands lay motionless against the sheets. She had never been this scared in her life. The hours after the crash had been a blur of flashing lights, shouting medics, and the crushing weight of uncertainty. Aaliyah barely remembered being airlifted off the mountain, barely registered the moment they wheeled Elias into emergency surgery. She only remembered the helplessness, the cold terror that gripped her as doctors surrounded him, their voices calm yet urgent, moving with the kind of efficiency that only came when life was hanging in the balance. And now, as the first rays of morning light filtered through the hospital window, bathing the room in a soft golden glow, she sat beside him, waiting, praying. He stirred, just slightly, his fingers twitching beneath hers. Her breath hitched as she leaned in, her voice a whisper. "Elias?" A slow exhale. His eyelids fluttered before finally, those familiar brown eyes opened, unfocused at first, then sharpening as they found her. Relief crashed over her so hard she nearly sobbed. "Oh my God," she breathed, squeezing his hand tighter. "You're awake." Elias blinked sluggishly, his expression shifting from confusion to recognition, and then something softer, something warm despite the pain lining his features. "Ali," he murmured, his voice hoarse. She let out a shaky laugh, bringing his hand to her lips. "Yeah, it's me." He tried to smile, but it turned into a grimace as pain lanced through him. She immediately pressed a hand to his chest, urging him to stay still. "Hey, don't move. You're in the hospital. Her voice broke. "You almost—" She couldn't say it. Couldn't say the words that had haunted her since the moment the helicopter started falling. Elias must have seen it in her eyes because he squeezed her fingers weakly. "I'm still here." A tear slipped down her cheek before she could stop it. "You almost weren't." His gaze softened. He looked exhausted, like it hurt just to exist, but still. He reached up, brushing his knuckles against her cheek. "But I am." Aaliyah inhaled deeply, forcing herself to breathe, to believe that he was truly here, that she hadn't lost him. "I thought—" Her voice wavered again. "I thought I was going to lose you." Elias swallowed hard, his own eyes dark with something heavy, something knowing. "I thought I was going to lose you, too." She shook her head. "No," she said fiercely. "I wouldn't have let that happen." A ghost of a smirk tugged at his lips. "You dragged me out of a burning helicopter, didn't you?" Aaliyah let out a choked laugh. "Yeah, I did." He exhaled a slow breath. "You saved my life." She met his gaze, her throat tightening. "You've always been my life." Silence stretched between them, heavy with everything they had been through, everything they had almost lost. Then the door creaked open, and Aaliyah turned to see a doctor step in, followed closely by a nurse. The doctor, a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes and a calm demeanor, offered a small smile. "Good to see you awake, Mr. Monroe." Elias tried to nod but winced at the effort. The doctor picked up his chart, scanning it before meeting his gaze again. "You're incredibly lucky," she said. "Your injuries are serious but survivable. 3 fractured ribs, a mild concussion, lacerations. Nothing we can't fix." Aaliyah clutched his hand tighter, as if grounding herself in those words. Survivable. The doctor turned her attention to her. "You, Mrs. Monroe, sustained a few cracked ribs and some nasty bruising, but nothing life-threatening." Aaliyah barely processed it. The pain in her own body was insignificant compared to what Elias had endured. The doctor continued, her expression turning more serious. "However, Mr. Monroe, we do need to monitor your internal bleeding. We were able to stabilize you, but if complications arise, you may need another procedure." Aaliyah's breath hitched, her grip on Elias's hand tightening, but he only nodded, his face unreadable. The doctor gave them a reassuring look. "For now, rest. We'll check in again soon." As soon as the doctor and nurse left, Aaliyah turned back to Elias, searching his face for any sign of fear. But he was calm, too calm. "Elias, I'm fine," he said, though his voice was weak. Her heart clenched. "You're not fine. You—" She shook her head. "Don't do that thing where you act like everything's okay when it isn't." He grinned and she blushed, and when she re-entered the office he nodded once as she walked. His lips curved slightly. "I'll heal, Allie." Her chest ached with something raw. "You almost didn't." His expression flickered then, something dark and unspoken passing through his eyes. "I know." The weight of it settled between them, the near death, the helplessness, the terrifying realization that fate had come so close to ripping them apart. She exhaled shakily. "I don't know what I would have done if... She broke off, swallowing hard. Elias lifted their joined hands, pressing a kiss against her fingers. "But you didn't have to find out." She nodded, blinking back tears. "I can't lose you." "You won't," he murmured. "I promise." For the first time since the crash, Aaliyah allowed herself to breathe. The next few days passed in a blur of hospital visits, tests, and slow recovery. The media swarmed outside, their tragic love story making headlines. Newlyweds. Survive. Devastating. Helicopter crash on wedding night. But Aaliyah didn't care about any of it. All that mattered was Elias. She spent every waking moment by his side, holding his hand, watching over him as if her presence alone could keep him safe. And slowly, painfully, he began to heal. On the 5th night, long after visiting hours ended, Aaliyah sat curled up in the chair beside his bed, her fingers absent-mindedly tracing patterns on his palm. Elias, still weak but improving, watched her with quiet amusement. "Are you ever going to leave this room?" She looked up, arching a brow. "Do you want me to?" "Never," he said immediately, his voice soft. She smiled, shifting closer. "Then, I'm staying." He sighed, reaching up to tuck a stray curl behind her ear. "Ali." Her smile faded at the seriousness in his tone. "What?" His eyes searched hers, something unreadable flickering in them. "When we were falling," he said quietly. I thought this was it. Elias swallowed hard. Elias, I wasn't afraid of dying, he continued, his voice barely above a whisper. I was afraid of leaving you. Tears welled in her eyes. You didn't? I don't want to waste any more time, he murmured. Not with you. Alia blinked rapidly, brushing her fingers against his cheek. We have all the time in the world, she whispered. But deep down, a tiny voice whispered back, do we? Because fate had tried to take him once. And she wasn't sure if it was done trying. The days turned into weeks. And though the bruises on Aaliyah's body faded, the weight of what had happened never truly left her. She still woke up in the middle of the night, gasping for air, her mind replaying the fall, the sickening impact, the feel of Elias's body slipping from her grasp. Even now, lying in their apartment with the warm glow of the city outside, she found herself reaching out, just to make sure he was still there, still breathing, still real. Elias stirred beside her, his body shifting beneath the blankets. His hand, strong despite the weeks of recovery, found hers instinctively, pulling her closer. Ellie, he murmured, voice thick with sleep. You okay? She hesitated, her fingers tightening around his. Yeah, she whispered, though it was a lie. Elias knew. He always did. He exhaled slowly, pressing a kiss to her forehead. You're still having nightmares. Elias swallowed hard. It's not just the nightmares, she admitted. It's everything. I keep thinking about what could have happened, what almost happened. Elias went quiet for a moment, his thumb tracing slow circles against the back of her hand. But it didn't, he finally said. She pulled back slightly, her eyes searching his. But what if it does? The words spilled out before she could stop them. What if fate isn't done with us? What if next time? There is no next time, Elias interrupted, his voice steady, firm. We survived, Aaliyah. We made it. She bit her lip, shaking her head. I can't just pretend like we weren't inches away from... Her voice broke, the memory too raw, too real. Elias cupped her face gently, tilting her chin so she had no choice but to look at him. Ali, he said softly, I know, believe me, I know, but we can't live like this, waiting for something to take us away from each other. That's not living. Her eyes burned with unshed tears. Then how do we move on? Elias studied her for a long moment before speaking. We don't move on, he said quietly. We move forward. Aaliyah let out a shaky breath, her heart aching at the simplicity of his words. Moving on meant leaving something behind. Moving forward meant carrying it with you, but refusing to let it define you. Maybe that was the answer. She nodded, exhaling deeply as she rested her forehead against his. Okay, she whispered. Okay. And for the first time in weeks, she felt like maybe, just maybe, she could believe it. The months that followed weren't easy. The accident had changed them in ways neither of them fully understood, but they refused to let it break them. Their love had already survived years of distance, of uncertainty, of growing pains. It had survived fire and falling and fear. They wouldn't let this be the thing that unraveled them. Aaliyah returned to her designs, pouring every emotion, every nightmare, every flicker of hope into her work. Her sketches became bolder, her fabrics richer, as if she was weaving pieces of herself into every thread. The industry noticed. Clients who had once seen her as just another emerging designer now spoke of her with something closer to reverence. There was a fire in her work that hadn't been there before, a depth that came from touching the edge of mortality and coming back changed. Elias, too, threw himself into his craft. Architecture had always been his way of leaving something permanent in a world that felt temporary, and now more than ever he needed that stability. He began designing a project of his own, one that wasn't for a client or for his firm, but for them, a home. Not just a house, but a space that would hold their history, their future, their love. They healed in pieces, but they healed together. Still, some wounds refused to fade entirely. One evening, months after the accident, they stood on the same cliffside where their wedding had taken place. The air was crisp, the scent of salt lingering in the breeze. Below them, the waves crashed against the rocks, the sound both familiar and haunting. Aaliyah closed her eyes, letting the wind whip through her hair. "It feels different now," she murmured. Elias stood beside her, his hands in his pockets, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Because we're different now." She turned to face him. "Do you regret it?" she asked, the question slipping out before she could stop it. Elias arched a brow. "Marrying you, not for a second." Aaliyah exhaled a soft laugh, shaking her head. "No, I mean, do you ever wonder what would have happened if we hadn't gotten on that helicopter?" Elias considered her words before responding. "I used to," he admitted, "but then I realized something." He met her gaze, his expression unshakable. "We would have ended up here anyway." She frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" Elias took a step closer, his fingers brushing against hers. "Ali, our love, our story, it was never meant to be ordinary. We were always going to have moments that tested us, pushed us. Whether it was a helicopter crash or something else, we were always going to have to fight for this." Aaliyah swallowed hard, his words settling deep into her chest. "And what if one day we don't win the fight?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Elias smiled then, soft, knowing. "Then we love each other so fiercely that if that day ever comes, we'll have no regrets." She stared at him, her heart pounding. Then, without hesitation, she reached up, cupping his face in her hands. "I don't ever want to waste a second," she whispered. "Then don't," Elias murmured, tilting his head down to kiss her. And in that moment, standing on the very ground where they had promised forever, Aaliyah finally understood. Love wasn't about guarantees. It wasn't about outrunning fate. It was about choosing each other, over and over, for as long as time allowed. The wind carried a single piece of fabric through the air, a delicate strip of white lace, caught on the branches of a nearby tree, a piece of her wedding veil, left behind from that fateful night. She stepped forward, reaching for it, but then she hesitated, and with a small, knowing smile, she let it go. The lace fluttered into the sky, carried by the wind, disappearing into the horizon. Aaliyah turned back to Elias, took his hand in hers, and together they walked away. Moving forward. Thank you for staying until the very end of this story. It means the world to share these moments with you. If there's one lesson to take from Aaliyah and Elias's journey, it's that life is unpredictable. Love is never guaranteed forever, But that doesn't mean we should fear it. It means we should cherish every second, love fiercely, and never take a single moment for granted. Because at the end of the day, it's not about how long love lasts. It's about how deeply it's felt. Fate may throw challenges in our way, but it's our choice to fight for the people who mean the most to us. We don't get to decide how much time we have, but we do get to decide how we use it. Where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear from you. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you never miss another incredible journey. More stories are on the way, and I can't wait to share them with you. Until next time, hold on to love and live without regrets.